The morning air on the wraparound porch was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pine needles and the rich, dark soil of the 300-acre agricultural estate I had spent every waking hour of my adult life turning into a multi-million-dollar supply empire. I was standing against the heavy cedar railing, a steaming mug of black coffee warming my hands, letting the morning breeze catch the heavy, copper-red curls falling over the collar of my worn denim jacket. It was a perfectly quiet, insulated Saturday. 35 years of relentless, obsessive work had built an impenetrable fortress around my life. I didn't let people in easily. I certainly didn't share my bank accounts, my property, or my peace with anyone. I was fundamentally, fiercely independent. Then, the crunch of tires on the long gravel driveway shattered the silence. A silver sedan with faded paint pulled up to the front steps. A man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit and scuffed shoes stepped out. He didn't look like a vendor. He didn't look like a lost tourist. He walked with the bored, mechanical efficiency of a man who delivered bad news for a living. He climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch, holding a thick, heavy manila envelope in his right hand. "Claire Sutton?" he asked, his voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "Yes, can I help you?" I replied, taking a step back, a sudden, inexplicable knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. He didn't explain. He didn't verify my identity further. He simply thrust the heavy envelope against my chest, forcing me to instinctively grab it to keep it from falling. "You've been served," he mumbled, turning his back immediately and walking down the steps. He was back in his car and kicking up gravel down the driveway before my brain could even process the interaction. I stood frozen on the porch, the heavy manila envelope resting in my hands. It felt unnaturally heavy, radiating a strange, bureaucratic dread. There was no return address, just my full legal name, printed in stark black capital letters. I set my coffee mug down on the cedar railing with a trembling hand. I tore the thick paper open, my thumb catching on the metal clasp, pulling out a stack of 50 dense, legally bound pages. The bold, terrifying typography of the header instantly pulled all the oxygen out of my lungs. In the family court of the state. Petition for dissolution of marriage. My eyes darted violently across the page, desperately trying to make sense of words that shouldn't exist in my reality. Petitioner: Declan Arthur Croft. Respondent: Claire Elizabeth Sutton. I stopped breathing. The paper began to shake violently in my hands. I didn't know anyone named Declan Arthur Croft. I had never heard that name in my entire 35 years of existence. I flipped to the second page, the legal jargon blurring together into a sickening, suffocating wave of panic. Petitioner requests an equitable division of all marital assets, including, but not limited to, the 300-acre Sutton estate, all associated agricultural corporate holdings, operational liquid capital, and the primary residential property. Petitioner requests permanent spousal support in the amount of $15,000 per month, citing the respondent's role as the primary financial provider during the tenure of the marriage. My knees gave out. I didn't gracefully lower myself. I physically collapsed, my knees slamming hard against the solid hardwood of the porch. The heavy stack of legal documents scattered across the wooden planks around me. The ceramic coffee mug I had placed on the railing tipped over, shattering on the ground, hot black liquid seeping into the wood. But I couldn't feel it. I was having a massive, blinding panic attack. My chest heaved as I hyperventilated, the edges of my vision turning black. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it was an absolute, terrifying violation of my reality. A complete stranger had legally anchored himself to my identity. He had bypassed my fortress, bypassed my security, and placed a federal claim on half of my blood, sweat, and tears. I felt utterly, hopelessly exposed, like my entire life had been hacked open and laid bare on a surgical table. I blindly reached into the pocket of my denim jacket with a shaking, numb hand and pulled out my phone. I hit the speed dial for David, my estate attorney, a viciously sharp litigator who had handled my grandmother's probate 2 years ago. He answered on the third ring. "Claire, it's Saturday morning. Is everything—" "David," I sobbed, the sound tearing out of my throat, raw and utterly pathetic. I sounded like a terrified child. "David, there was a man on my porch. He handed me papers. Divorce papers, David. Someone is suing me for divorce, and he wants half my farm. I don't know who he is. I'm not married. I've never been married." The line went dead silent for 2 seconds. When David spoke again, the friendly weekend tone was completely gone, replaced by the clinical high-speed focus of a crisis lawyer. "Claire, breathe. Pick up the first page of the document," David commanded. "Look at the top right corner. Read me the docket number and the filing jurisdiction." I scrambled on my hands and knees across the porch, my fingernails scraping against the wood as I grabbed the primary petition. Tears were streaming down my face, blurring my vision. I blinked hard, forcing my eyes to focus on the stamped ink. "Docket 44-B-902, I gasped, my chest heaving. "Family court. Filed yesterday morning." I heard the frantic, rapid clicking of David's mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line as he logged directly into the state's judicial database. 10 agonizing seconds passed. The silence was suffocating. "I have the file," David said. His voice was incredibly heavy. It wasn't the voice of a lawyer dismissing a clerical error. It was the voice of a lawyer looking at a catastrophe. "Claire, this isn't a clerical mix-up. This is a fully executed, notarized, and legally binding marriage certificate. It was filed 8 months ago in Clark County, Nevada. It has your social security number. It has your exact date of birth. And it has a signature that perfectly matches the biometric ink analysis on your corporate tax returns." A cold, paralyzing shockwave rippled down my spine, instantly freezing the tears on my face. To execute a double proxy marriage in a loose jurisdiction like Nevada without my physical presence, a fraudster wouldn't just need my social security number. They would need my original embossed birth certificate. They would need high-resolution copies of my driver's license. They would need intimate, foundational documents that I kept locked in a fireproof safe inside my house. Only 2 people on planet Earth had ever had unrestricted access to that safe. Only 2 people knew the combination because I had foolishly given it to them before my grandmother died, before I realized they were financial parasites and cut them entirely out of my life. My parents. "Claire, are you still there?" David asked, his voice tight with concern. "Listen to me. We need to file an emergency injunction on Monday morning. If this man gets a preliminary hearing, he can request the judge to freeze your operational accounts until the divorce is finalized. He could paralyze the entire estate." I didn't answer right away. I sat on the hard wooden planks of my porch, surrounded by the shattered pieces of my coffee mug and the scattered pages of my own engineered destruction. The suffocating, hyperventilating terror that had gripped my chest just 3 minutes ago was suddenly, violently gone. It evaporated, replaced by a cold, dark, and absolute fury. They hadn't just tried to steal my money. My own parents had sold my identity to a ghost, turning my life into a crime scene just to get a piece of the inheritance they felt entitled to. "Don't file the injunction, David," I whispered. My voice was no longer trembling. It was as hard and sharp as broken glass. "What, Claire, you have to. We need to contest the validity of the marriage immediately, or—" I said no, I commanded, pulling myself up off the floor, my boots planting firmly on the wood. I wiped the last tear from my cheek. If we contest the marriage now, they scatter. They delete the emails, they burn the burner phones, and they claim they are victims of the same fraud. I am not going to let them run. I looked out over the 300 acres of prime timber and agricultural land that belonged to me. If Declan Croft wants a divorce, I said, a terrifying predatory calm settling over my entire body. Then we are going to give him a divorce. Pull his financial records, David. Pull everything. Hire the most vicious private investigator on your payroll. I want to know what this ghost had for breakfast 10 years ago. Because when I sit across the mediation table from him, I'm going to take every single thing he owns. For 21 days, I didn't sleep. Identity theft is not merely a financial crime. It is a profound, visceral, psychological violation. It felt as though a stranger was living under my skin. Every time my phone rang, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. Every time I signed a payroll check for my farmhands, my hand trembled. Wondering if my accounts had been frozen by a judge's gavel in a courtroom I wasn't even aware of. The 300 acres of prime timber and agricultural soil that had always been my sanctuary suddenly felt like a massive, vulnerable target painted on my back. I kept working. I had to. I spent my days in the mud and the diesel fumes of the heavy machinery, wearing my scuffed leather work boots, rigid denim, and a thick canvas jacket, tying my heavy copper-red curls back into a tight, messy knot. I physically exhausted myself on the estate, desperately trying to burn off the suffocating anxiety. But at night, alone in the sprawling, silent farmhouse, I sat in the dark with a glass of bourbon, staring at the Nevada marriage certificate, mapping the architecture of my vengeance. On the 22nd day, the waiting ended. David, my estate attorney, did not call. He simply drove his black Lexus SUV up the long, tree-lined gravel driveway of the estate, parking next to my mud-spattered heavy-duty truck. He wasn't alone. I met them in my home office, a massive room of exposed oak beams, leather furniture, and topological maps of the property. I didn't offer them coffee. I stood behind my heavy reclaimed wood desk, my hands planted firmly on the surface, waiting. The man who walked in behind David was built like a cinder block. He wore a muted gray suit that didn't quite hide the thick, muscular tension in his shoulders. He had the cold, dead-eyed stare of a man who had spent his entire life looking at the ugliest fractions of human nature. "Claire, this is Marcus Vance," David said, skipping the pleasantries as he closed the heavy oak door behind them. He spent 12 years as a forensic investigator for the Treasury Department before moving to the private sector. He is the most ruthless asset tracker I have ever met. Vance didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. He simply walked to my desk and dropped a massive, heavily bound black dossier onto the polished wood. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "You don't have a husband, Miss Sutton," Vance stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute silence in the room. "You have a parasite. His legal name is Arthur Vance Pendleton, though he operates under 6 known aliases, including Declan Croft. He is 42 years old, and he is a professional, high-end grifter." I stared at the black folder, my pulse beginning to race. The exhaustion of the last 3 weeks instantly replaced by a razor-sharp, predatory focus. "Show me." Vance flipped the heavy cover open. The first page was a high-resolution surveillance photograph of a man in a tailored suit, sipping espresso at a high-end outdoor cafe. He was handsome in a generic, forgettable way, the exact kind of face designed to disarm wealthy, lonely targets. "Pendleton specializes in matrimonial fraud," Vance explained, tapping a blunt finger against the photograph. "He targets women who have recently inherited substantial liquid assets but are socially isolated. He fabricates a romantic history, utilizes forged double proxy marriage licenses in states with notoriously lax verification protocols, like Nevada or Montana, and then files for a contested divorce in a different jurisdiction to force a rapid financial settlement. He sues them, terrifies them, and offers to make the lawsuit disappear for a fraction of their net worth," David interjected, his legal mind analyzing the mechanics of the extortion. Most victims are so paralyzed by the fear of a drawn-out, public court battle that they just write him a check for $500,000 to go away. Exactly, Vance nodded. But to pull off a double proxy marriage without triggering federal red flags, Pendleton needed original embossed documents. He needed a pristine Social Security card, an original birth certificate, and a verified signature sample. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, a cold, bitter knot forming in my throat. I knew exactly where those documents came from. Vance turned the page of the dossier, revealing a complex, color-coded financial flowchart. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. 3 months ago, your parents, Robert and Elaine Sutton, took out a second mortgage on their suburban home, Vance stated, delivering the fatal blow with clinical precision. They extracted $75,000 in liquid cash. They didn't declare it. Instead, they structured the withdrawals into increments of $9,000 to avoid triggering CTR, currency transaction reports, at the bank. He traced a red line on the chart with his finger, connecting my parents' bank to an offshore shell company. They wired $60,000 to an LLC registered in the Cayman Islands. That LLC is entirely controlled by Arthur Pendleton. Your parents didn't just leak your identity, Ms. Sutton. They financed the hit. They paid him a retainer to legally hijack your life, with the obvious expectation of a massive kickback once he successfully extorted half of your agricultural empire in the divorce. The silence in the home office was absolute. The sheer sociopathic magnitude of the betrayal hung in the air like a physical weight. My own flesh and blood had mortgaged their house to hire a financial assassin to destroy me. They thought I was just a solitary farmer who would break under the pressure of a courtroom. They thought I would cry, panic, and hand over the keys to the kingdom. I looked down at the financial flowchart. I traced the black ink representing Pendleton's Cayman Islands LLC. Does he have other money in that offshore account? Mr. Vance? I asked, my voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, deadpan register. Money from his previous victims? Vance let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Oh, yes. Pendleton is a highly successful parasite. We pierced the corporate veil of the LLC using a shadow audit. He has roughly $2.4 million sitting in that account, completely undeclared to the IRS. I slowly lifted my head. I looked at David, my attorney, and then at Vance. A slow, deeply dangerous smile finally broke across my face, cracking the cold, exhausted mask I had worn for 3 weeks. David, I said, the copper-red curls falling over my shoulders as I leaned over the heavy dossier. Declan Croft filed for divorce under the premise that we are legally married, correct? Yes, David answered cautiously, adjusting his glasses, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the room's atmosphere. He filed in a community property state. He is claiming that 50% of everything you own belongs to him. If we are married under the eyes of the law, and we are entering a contested divorce regarding community property, I paused, letting the brilliant, lethal realization sink in. Then under the rules of legal discovery, I have the absolute unrestricted right to conduct a forensic audit of his marital assets, because technically, his money is my money. David's eyes widened behind his glasses. The legal mechanic clicked into place. Claire, if he hides that $2.4 million during the financial disclosure phase of the divorce and signs a sworn affidavit under penalty of perjury, he commits a federal crime, Vance finished the thought, a sharp, predatory grin mirroring my own. Fraud, perjury, and actively attempting to conceal assets from a family court judge. We aren't going to fight the marriage certificate, I commanded, shutting the heavy black dossier with a definitive, echoing snap. We are going to give my loving parents and my fake husband exactly what they want. We are going to surrender. I walked around the desk, the heavy soles of my boots clicking against the hardwood floor. "David, call Pendleton's attorney on Monday morning," I instructed, my voice ringing with absolute Sorkin-esque authority. "Tell him that I am terrified. Tell him that the stress is destroying my health, and I am desperate to avoid a public trial. Tell him I want to arrange a private, binding mediation settlement. Tell him I am willing to cut a cashier's check for $2 million to buy him out of the marriage." "Baiting the trap," David murmured, pulling a legal pad from his briefcase, his pen already flying across the paper. "Exactly," I said, looking out the large window at the sprawling green acres of my empire. "They won't be able to resist a guaranteed immediate payout. They'll come to the table to sign the papers and collect their blood money. But I want a formalized deposition of assets prior to the signing. I want Pendleton and my parents in that room, on the record, swearing under oath that they have disclosed all finances." I turned back to the two men, the absolute zero temperature of my anger radiating through the room. "And when they lie on that federal recording," I whispered cleanly, "we aren't just going to send them to prison. I am going to use the community property laws they tried to use against me, and I am going to legally confiscate every single dime that con artist has ever stolen." The air conditioning in the glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of David's downtown law firm was set to a clinical, freezing 64 degrees. It smelled of lemon polish, expensive leather, and the impending catastrophic destruction of 3 human lives. I sat perfectly still on one side of the massive mahogany table. I had abandoned the heavy canvas work jackets of the farm. Instead, I wore a tailored, sharp navy blue blazer over a crisp white silk blouse, paired with dark, rigid denim, and my custom leather boots. My copper-red curls were pulled back tightly into an uncompromising, severe knot at the base of my neck. I had spent the last 48 hours actively practicing the physical manifestation of defeat. I rounded my shoulders slightly. I kept my gaze lowered. I let the natural exhaustion of my insomnia paint dark, bruised shadows under my green eyes. I looked exactly like a broken, terrified 35-year-old woman who was about to surrender her empire just to make the nightmare stop. Across the wide expanse of polished wood sat the architects of my misery. Arthur Pendleton, operating under the legal fiction of Declan Croft, leaned back in his plush leather chair with breathtaking sociopathic ease. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray Italian suit that cost more than a commercial tractor transmission. His teeth were perfectly capped, his hair impeccably styled, and the heavy scent of an aggressive, expensive cologne wafted across the table. He looked at me not with hostility, but with the patronizing, gentle pity of a predator, watching a wounded animal bleed out. Next to him sat his attorney, a sweaty, fast-talking strip mall litigator who was clearly out of his depth in a high-rise corporate firm, but was aggressively salivating at the prospect of his contingency fee on a $2 million settlement. And seated directly behind Pendleton, forming a unified, physical wall of absolute betrayal, were my parents. Robert Sutton wore a cashmere golf sweater, his hands resting comfortably on his lap. Elaine Sutton clutched a designer handbag that she absolutely could not afford on her current credit score. They had willingly answered David's subpoena to appear as character witnesses to the marriage. They thought they were here to forcefully validate the fraudulent Nevada union, ensuring that I couldn't back out of the settlement at the last minute. They looked at me with expressions of faux parental concern, masking the vicious, ravenous greed burning in their pupils. In the corner of the room, entirely ignored by the 3 criminals, sat a quiet, unassuming woman. Her hands hovered expertly over the keys of a modern, digital stenograph machine. "Let the record reflect that it is 10:15 in the morning on Thursday," David said, his voice a smooth, frictionless baritone as he pressed the flashing red recording button on the conference table's central microphone. This is a sworn deposition and financial disclosure mediation regarding the dissolution of marriage between Declan Croft and Claire Sutton. All parties are present. All parties are represented by counsel." David adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Pendleton. "Mr. Croft," David began, seamlessly adopting the role of a meticulous, bureaucratic lawyer, just trying to cross his T's before handing over a massive check. "My client has agreed to a binding, non-disclosure settlement of $2 million in liquid capital to satisfy your claim of community property against the Sutton agricultural estate. However, before my client authorizes the wire transfer, state law requires a sworn, comprehensive disclosure of all your current assets and liabilities. We need to ensure there is no hidden marital debt that could fall upon my client post-dissolution." Pendleton's sleazy attorney leaned forward, waving a dismissive hand. "We submitted the financial affidavit yesterday, counselor. My client is a modest freelance consultant. He has $12,000 in a checking account and a leased sedan. He has no other assets. Let's not drag this out and torture your poor client any further. She's clearly under extreme distress." I let a small, pathetic whimper escape my throat, burying my face in my hands. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of a shattered woman. "I appreciate your urgency, counselor," David replied cleanly, "but I need your client to state it for the federal record, under oath." David slid a crisp, printed document across the mahogany table. It was the standard financial disclosure affidavit, heavily stamped by a notary. "Declan Arthur Croft," David said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of the law. "Do you swear, under penalty of perjury, pursuant to Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1621, that this affidavit represents the absolute totality of your global financial assets? Do you swear that you possess no offshore holdings, hidden bank accounts, shell corporations, or undeclared liquidity?" Pendleton didn't even blink. The arrogance of a man who had successfully pulled this exact scam a dozen times before blinded him completely to the architecture of the room. He placed his perfectly manicured hand flat on the document. "I swear, under penalty of perjury," Pendleton stated clearly into the microphone, "I have fully disclosed my finances. I have no other assets." The court reporter's fingers flew across the stenograph, permanently carving the federal felony into the legal record. "Thank you," David said softly. He then shifted his gaze to the two people sitting behind the grifter. "Mr. and Mrs. Sutton, you are here under subpoena to verify the validity of this union. You are also under oath. Do you swear that you witnessed the relationship between your daughter and Mr. Croft, and that to your knowledge, this was a legitimate, cohabitating marriage?" Robert Sutton leaned forward, adopting a deeply solemn, paternal expression that made my stomach violently turn. "We do," Robert lied, his voice projecting clearly into the microphone. "Claire has always been secretive. We attended a small, private ceremony in Nevada. We just want what is equitable for Declan. He was a good husband, and he deserves a fair share of the estate they built together." "Yes," Elaine chimed in, wiping a completely fabricated tear from the corner of her eye. "It breaks my heart to see it end, but the law is the law. The settlement is the right thing. Do, Claire. It's time to move on." They had done it. They had willingly, arrogantly stepped directly into the federal slaughterhouse and locked the door behind themselves. They had committed coordinated perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and extortion, all perfectly captured in high-definition audio by a certified court reporter. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. The hunched, terrified posture vanished entirely. My spine straightened into a rigid, uncompromising line of pure steel. The bruised, exhausted look in my green eyes was instantly consumed by a cold, calculating, and predatory fire The sudden violent shift in my physical presence was so jarring that Pendleton actually stopped breathing for a fraction of a second, his smug smile faltering. I reached down into the leather briefcase resting at my feet. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out the massive, heavy black dossier that former Treasury investigator Marcus Vance had delivered to my farmhouse. I dropped it onto the polished mahogany table. It hit the wood with a loud, violent crack that echoed off the glass walls. "You're absolutely right, Dad," I said, my voice completely stripped of the pathetic, trembling weakness from 60 seconds ago. It was a freezing, lethal whisper that carried across the table like a physical blow. The law is the law, and under the community property statutes of this state, any financial asset acquired or hidden by a spouse during the tenure of the marriage is legally subject to a 50% division. I flipped the heavy cover of the dossier open. "So, Declan," I continued, staring directly into the eyes of the professional parasite who had tried to steal my life, "let's talk about the Cayman Islands." The name Cayman Islands hit the freezing air of the conference room like a live grenade. Arthur Pendleton's bespoke, charcoal gray Italian suit suddenly looked incredibly restrictive. The smug, patronizing smile vanished from his perfectly capped teeth, replaced by a rigid, microscopic twitch in his left jaw muscle. Behind him, my father, Robert, gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned a sickly, translucent white against his cashmere sweater. I object to this entire line of questioning," Pendleton's strip mall litigator stammered, his bravado instantly evaporating as he looked at the massive black dossier. He reached across the mahogany table, desperately trying to pull the narrative back. "My client's financial affidavit is complete. This mediation is about the Sutton estate, not baseless accusations about offshore." "This mediation," David interrupted, his voice dropping like an iron anvil, "is an official discovery proceeding in a contested divorce. Your client opened the door the moment he filed the petition. You claimed my client's assets were your assets. In doing so, you legally gave us absolute, unrestricted subpoena power over your client's entire global financial footprint. I didn't look at the lawyer. I kept my green eyes locked entirely on the 42-year-old grifter sitting across from me. I opened the thick black folder and pulled out an 8x10 glossy photograph, sliding it across the polished wood. It was a surveillance photo of Pendleton, looking completely relaxed at a high-end European cafe. "Arthur Vance Pendleton," I read cleanly from the Treasury report, the copper-red curls brushing against the collar of my navy blazer as I leaned forward. I didn't yell. The absolute zero temperature of my voice was far more terrifying. Also known as Declan Croft, a professional matrimonial fraudster with active, unserved federal warrants for mail fraud and wire extortion. Pendleton didn't reach for the photo. He stared at it as if the glossy paper was coated in anthrax. "This is absurd," Elaine, my mother, gasped from the back row. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest, her chin-length blonde hair trembling as she desperately tried to maintain the illusion. "Claire, what are you doing? Declan is your husband. Stop this nonsense right now before you ruin the settlement." I slowly shifted my gaze from the parasite to the people who had hired him. 3 months ago, Mom," I said, my voice adopting the clinical, devastating precision of an auditor dissecting a crime scene. "You and Dad took out a $75,000 second mortgage on your suburban home. You extracted the liquid cash in structured increments of exactly $9,000. Robert's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his 65-year-old face. "You structured the withdrawals specifically to bypass the bank's currency transaction reports," I continued, sliding a massive color-coded forensic financial flowchart across the mahogany table directly toward them. "You then wired $60,000 to a shell LLC registered in the Cayman Islands. a shell company wholly owned and operated by Arthur Pendleton. You didn't just steal my birth certificate from the fireproof safe to forge a Nevada marriage proxy. You financed my destruction. You hired a hitman. We didn't, Robert choked out, a pathetic, reedy wheeze escaping his throat. He looked at Pendleton with wild, terrified eyes, realizing the grifter had left a massive, easily traceable digital footprint leading right to their front door. "But here is the truly beautiful part of your scam, Arthur," I said, bringing my focus back to the fraudster in the charcoal suit. I reached into the dossier and pulled out the final document, the bank statement. Because you were so incredibly greedy, you didn't just use that Cayman LLC to hide my parents' retainer. You used it to hide the life savings you extorted from your previous victims. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the bottom line of the offshore ledger. $2.4 million in undeclared liquidity, I stated clearly for the court reporters. Microphone. Pendleton finally broke. The slick, confident con artist shattered into pieces. He lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the mahogany table. "You can't touch that money. It's in an offshore trust. It has nothing to do with this." "It has everything to do with this," David replied smoothly, a vicious, predatory smile spreading across his face. He leaned over the table, delivering the legal kill shot. "You just swore under penalty of federal perjury that you only had $12,000 to your name. You actively concealed $2.4 million from a family court judge." I stood up slowly, the heavy soles of my leather boots planting firmly on the floor. I looked down at the men who had tried to take my 300-acre empire. "Under the family law statutes of this state, Arthur," I whispered, the cold, lethal logic of the trap finally snapping shut around his throat. "When a spouse fraudulently conceals marital assets during a divorce proceeding, the judge does not simply divide the hidden money in half. To punish the fraud, the court awards 100% of the concealed assets to the defrauded spouse." Pendleton froze. His breathing stopped. The terrifying realization hit his brain like a freight train. "You wanted to use the rules of a community property marriage to steal half of my farm," I said, leaning over the mahogany wood, my face inches from his. "Congratulations, husband. We are playing by the rules of marriage, and I am legally confiscating every single dime you have ever stolen in your entire pathetic life." Pendleton's attorney, the sweaty, fast-talking strip mall litigator, suddenly stood up. He looked at the financial flow chart. He looked at the sworn perjury affidavit his client had just signed, and he looked at the digital stenograph machine permanently recording the federal crimes. He didn't say a word. He violently shoved his legal pads into his briefcase, snapped it shut, and sprinted for the glass door of the conference room. He grabbed the heavy stainless steel handle and pulled. The door didn't move. It was locked from the outside. The lawyer rattled the handle in blind panic, his face pressing against the glass. "Let me out! I am formally withdrawing as counsel. I have nothing to do with this." I didn't look at the fleeing coward. I kept my eyes locked on Pendleton and my parents, watching the absolute, unadulterated terror consume them as they realized they were locked inside a glass cage. "The door isn't locked to keep you in, Arthur," I said softly, stepping back from the table and smoothing the lapels of my navy blazer. "It's locked to give the federal marshals time to secure the elevators." The heavy stainless steel handle of the conference room door did not rattle again. Instead, a sharp electronic click echoed through the glass walls as the magnetic lock was remotely disengaged from the reception desk. The heavy glass door swung open. 3 men stepped into the freezing, lemon-scented air of the 42nd floor. They did not wear bespoke Italian suits or cashmere golf sweaters. They wore dark utilitarian tactical windbreakers with the gold star of the United States Marshal Service pinned to their chests. Behind them walked Marcus Vance. my investigator, his cinder-block frame filling the doorway, his dead-eyed stare locked directly onto the 42-year-old grifter at the table. Arthur Pendleton didn't try to run. The slick, arrogant, matrimonial fraudster simply collapsed back into his plush leather chair. The color drained from his perfectly tanned face, leaving behind a sickly, chalky white. He knew exactly what the men in the windbreakers meant. It wasn't a civil lawsuit anymore. It was a federal indictment. "Arthur Vance Pendleton," the lead marshal announced, his voice a booming, authoritative thunderclap that completely shattered the silence of the room. He walked directly toward the mahogany table, unhooking the heavy steel restraints from his tactical belt. "You are under arrest for aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit extortion, and federal perjury." The sleazy strip mall litigator, who had been pressing himself flat against the glass wall like a terrified insect, immediately raised both his hands in the air. "I invoke safe harbor. I was lied to by my client. I had no prior knowledge of the fraudulent proxy." The marshals ignored him, yanking Pendleton out of his expensive chair and forcefully securing his wrists behind his back. The ratcheting click of the metal teeth echoed violently. But the true devastation was happening on the other side of the table. Robert Sutton, the man who had raised me, the man who had secretly mortgaged his own home to finance a hit on my life, let out a pathetic, trembling gasp. He stood up on shaky legs, reaching a hand out toward me. Claire, please," Robert begged, his 65-year-old voice cracking into a high-pitched, reedy whine. All the patriarchal authority was entirely gone. He looked like a terrified, broken old man. "You have to tell them we didn't know. We didn't know he was a criminal, Claire. We thought you needed someone. We thought it was a real marriage. You can't let them do this to us. We're your parents." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I stood perfectly still in my navy blazer and rigid denim, my copper-red curls framing a face made of absolute unforgiving stone. "You didn't think I needed someone, Robert," I whispered, delivering the final surgical cut with devastating precision. "You thought I needed to be broken. You thought if you squeezed me hard enough, I would panic, and you would get a piece of the inheritance you felt entitled to." "Claire, no!" Elaine shrieked. My mother fell to her knees, the designer handbag dropping to the floor, spilling its contents across the polished wood. Her chin-length blonde hair was a disheveled mess. She reached out, desperately, grabbing the hem of my blazer. "Please, they're going to take our house. We took out a second mortgage for him. We have nothing left. You have to protect us." I looked down at her. I felt absolutely nothing. The biological tether that had tied me to them had been completely severed the moment that process server stepped onto my porch. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my blazer out of her desperate grasp. "You protected your investment, Elaine," I said, my green eyes completely devoid of warmth. "Now I am protecting mine." I looked up at the second U.S. Marshal and gave a single, definitive nod. The Marshal stepped forward, grabbing Robert by the arm of his cashmere sweater, while another hauled a sobbing, hysterical Elaine up from the floor. "Robert and Elaine Sutton," the Marshal recited, turning them toward the glass door. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, accessory to identity theft, and perjury." I stood silently next to David, my estate attorney, and watched the architects of my nightmare being frog-marched out of the pristine corporate conference room in federal iron. They were completely, hopelessly ruined, and they had built the slaughterhouse themselves. The legal fallout was a masterpiece of forensic warfare. Because Pendleton had arrogantly signed a sworn federal affidavit claiming we were legally married, David used the family court system as a weapon of mass financial destruction. We didn't just annul the marriage immediately. First, we allowed the family court judge to review the perjury and the hidden $2.4 million Cayman Islands account. Under state law, as punitive damages for fraudulent concealment of marital assets, the judge awarded me 100% of Pendleton's offshore money. Only after the wire transfer cleared my estate's accounts did the judge strike the forged Nevada marriage certificate from the federal record, erasing the ghost from my life permanently. Arthur Pendleton was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. My parents, Robert and Elaine, having unknowingly left a flawless paper trail of bank wires and text messages to the grifter, were each sentenced to 5 years. Because they had blown their second mortgage on Pendleton's retainer, the bank foreclosed on their suburban home while they were awaiting trial. They lost absolutely everything. As for me, I didn't keep the $2.4 million of blood money. I used my pristine corporate network to track down the 6 other women Pendleton had previously extorted, and I quietly wired them their life savings back, with interest. 14 months later, the morning air on the wraparound porch was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pine needles and the rich, dark soil of my 300-acre agricultural estate. I stood against the heavy cedar railing, wearing my worn denim jacket, letting the morning breeze catch my heavy, copper-red curls. I held a steaming mug of black, coffee in my hands. The silver sedan was gone. The fake lawsuit was gone. The parasites were gone. 35 years of relentless, obsessive work had built an impenetrable fortress around my life, and I had just proven to the world exactly what happens to anyone stupid enough to try and break the gates. If your own parents stole your birth certificate, forged a fake marriage in another state, and hired a professional con artist to sue you for half of everything you owned, would you have paid the settlement just to make the nightmare go away? Or would you have played their game, audited their offshore accounts, and legally confiscated millions of dollars right in front of them? Let me know exactly how you would handle this level of sociopathic family betrayal in the comments below. If you love this story of cold, calculating justice, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.